The barn door swung open with a groan that cut through the December wind, and Frank Owens felt his heart constrict at the sight of the woman huddled in the corner, her shoulders shaking with sobs that tore through the frozen air like prayers no one had answered. Frank had ridden into Telluride, Colorado 3 days before Christmas in 1882, bringing a herd of cattle down from the high country before the worst of the winter storms trapped them all. He had not expected to find anyone in Old Man Henderson's abandoned barn, certainly not a young woman in a threadbare dress that did little to protect her from the December cold that swept down from the San Juan Mountains. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, and even in the dim light filtering through the gaps in the barn walls, he could see her lips had taken on a bluish tinge. "Miss," Frank said, his voice rough from days on the trail. He was 26 years old, had seen his share of hardship in this unforgiving territory, but something about the sight of her suffering moved him in a way he could not quite explain. "Miss, you cannot stay here. You will freeze to death before morning." The woman's head snapped up, and Frank found himself looking into the most striking pair of green eyes he had ever seen. Fear flickered across her face, then resignation, as though she had already accepted whatever fate had in store for her. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with delicate features that spoke of better days, though her cheeks were hollow from hunger and her hands were red and raw from the cold. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please just leave me be. I have nowhere else to go." Frank took a step closer, then another, moving slowly as he might approach a wounded animal. His sheepskin coat was warm, his boots sturdy, and he suddenly felt guilty for every comfort he possessed while this woman suffered in the cold. "What is your name?" She hesitated, wrapping her arms more tightly around herself. Victoria Nash." "Well, Miss Nash, I am Frank Owens, and I cannot in good conscience leave you here to freeze." He shrugged out of his coat and moved toward her, draping it over her shoulders before she could protest. The coat swallowed her small frame and she clutched at it with trembling fingers. "When did you last eat?" Victoria's eyes filled with fresh tears, and she turned her face away. "I do not remember." The admission struck Frank like a physical blow. He thought of the jerky and hardtack in his saddlebags, the warm meal waiting for him at the boarding house in town, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "You are coming with me. I have a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. She is a good woman and she will not turn you away." "I cannot pay," Victoria said, her voice breaking on the words. "I have nothing, I am nothing." Frank knelt beside her, and for the first time he noticed the bruises on her wrists, the fear that went deeper than cold or hunger. Someone had hurt this woman, had broken her spirit as surely as the winter had broken her body. Something fierce and protective surged through him, a feeling he had not experienced since his younger sister had died of fever 5 years ago. "You listen to me, Victoria Nash," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You will cry only tears of joy from now on. I give you my word on that." She stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign language, as though the concept of joy was so alien she could not comprehend it. "You do not know what I have done, what has been done to me." "I do not need to know," Frank said. "Not unless you want to tell me. All I know is that no woman deserves to freeze to death in a barn on Christmas week." "Now, can you stand?" Victoria nodded, and Frank helped her to her feet. She swayed and he caught her, feeling how light she was, how fragile. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper, waited outside, stamping his feet against the cold. Frank lifted Victoria onto the saddle, then swung up behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to keep her steady. She stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed against him, seeking whatever warmth his body could provide. The ride into Telluride took 20 minutes, though it felt longer with the wind biting at their faces and the snow beginning to fall in earnest. The town was small but growing, fueled by silver mining in the surrounding mountains. Gas lamps glowed in windows, and Frank could hear the tinny sound of a piano from one of the saloons. It was a rough town, full of miners and gamblers and men looking to make their fortunes. But it also had families, churches, and women like Mrs. Patterson who brought civilization to the wild frontier. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house stood on a quieter street, a two-story building with white paint that gleamed even in the gathering darkness. Frank dismounted, then helped Victoria down, keeping his arm around her when her knees buckled. The front door opened before they reached it, and Mrs. Patterson herself stood in the doorway, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Frank Owens, what have you brought me?" she demanded, but her voice was not unkind. "A woman in need of help, Mrs. Patterson," Frank said. "She was freezing in Henderson's old barn. She needs food, warmth, and a safe place to rest." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened as she took in Victoria's appearance. She had raised 6 children of her own and had a mother's instinct for suffering. "Bring her in, bring her in." "Good Lord, child, you are half frozen. Come by the fire." The warmth of the boarding house hit them like a wave, and Victoria gasped at the sudden change in temperature. Mrs. Patterson guided her to a chair by the large iron stove in the common room, wrapping a thick blanket around her shoulders, even though she still wore Frank's coat. The landlady disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later with a bowl of beef stew and a thick slice of bread. "Eat slowly," Mrs. Patterson warned as Victoria reached for the bowl with shaking hands. "Your stomach will rebel if you eat too fast." Victoria nodded and took a small spoonful, and Frank watched as her eyes closed in what looked like rapture at the taste of hot food. He felt that protective surge again, stronger this time, and he knew with a certainty that surprised him that he could not simply leave this woman here and walk away. Whatever had brought Victoria Nash to that barn, whatever demons chased her, he would stand between her and them. Mrs. Patterson pulled Frank aside while Victoria ate. "What do you know about her?" "Nothing, except that someone hurt her," Frank said quietly. "Look at her wrists. Look at the fear in her eyes." The landlady's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Running from a man, I would wager, a husband or a father." "I do not know, but I promised her she would be safe," Frank said. "I know I have no right to ask this, but could you give her a room? I will pay for it." "For how long, Frank? You are a good man, but you are a cowboy, always moving with the seasons. What happens when you leave in the spring?" It was a fair question, and Frank had no answer. He looked at Victoria, who was eating more steadily now, some color returning to her cheeks. "I do not know, but I cannot leave her with nothing." Mrs. Patterson studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "She can have the small room at the end of the hall, but Frank, be careful. A woman running from something can bring trouble with her." "I know," Frank said. "I will handle it." Over the next few days, as Christmas approached, Victoria slowly began to recover. Mrs. Patterson gave her clean clothes, simple dresses that had belonged to her daughters, and Victoria helped with the cooking and cleaning to earn her keep. She spoke little, moving through the boarding house like a ghost, always watchful, always alert for danger. Frank found excuses to stay in Telluride rather than heading back to the ranch where he worked. He told himself he needed to make sure his cattle were properly sold, that the winter weather required him to wait before traveling, but he knew the truth. He could not leave Victoria until he was certain she was truly safe on Christmas Eve. Frank invited Victoria to accompany him to the town's church service. She hesitated, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her skirt. "I am not sure I am welcome in a church." Why would you not be welcome?" Frank asked gently. Victoria's eyes filled with tears and she turned away. "You do not know what I have been, Mr. Owens, what I was forced to become." Frank moved to stand in front of her, waiting until she raised her eyes to his. "I do not care about your past, Victoria. I care about your future, and I believe God cares more about where you are going than where you have been." She searched his face as though looking for deception, for the cruel joke that would reveal this kindness was all an illusion. When she found only sincerity, something in her seemed to crack open and the tears spilled over. "Why are you being so kind to me? What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Frank said, and he meant it. "I want nothing except to see you smile, to see you safe and happy. That is all." Victoria covered her face with her hands and wept, great shaking sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Frank pulled her gently into his arms, and this time she did not stiffen or pull away. She clung to him, and he held her while she cried out all the pain and fear and loneliness she had been carrying. When the storm finally passed, she looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I will go to church with you," she whispered. The Christmas Eve service was simple but beautiful, with candles glowing in every window and the congregation singing hymns that echoed off the wooden walls. Victoria sat beside Frank, and he noticed how she mouthed the words to the songs as though she had known them once, long ago, before life had stolen them from her. When the service ended and people filed out into the snowy night, several women approached Victoria with warm smiles, welcoming her to Telluride. She responded shyly, but Frank could see the surprise and gratitude in her eyes at being treated with kindness and respect. They walked back to the boarding house through streets frosted with fresh snow, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Victoria had borrowed a heavy cloak from Mrs. Patterson, and she pulled it tight around herself, but she walked close to Frank, as though his presence alone provided warmth. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you have done for me." "You do not need to thank me," Frank replied. "I am only glad I found you when I did." Victoria was quiet for a moment, then said, "I suppose you want to know my story." "Only if you want to tell me," Frank said. "You do not owe me anything, Victoria." She took a deep breath, and the words began to spill out as though now that she had started, she could not stop. "I was married to a man named Gerald Sutton. I met him in Denver 2 years ago. He was charming, attentive, everything a girl dreams of. My parents were dead, and I was working as a seamstress, barely making enough to live on. When Gerald proposed, I thought my prayers had been answered." Frank felt his jaw tighten but said nothing, letting her speak. "He changed after the wedding. He became cruel, controlling. He would fly into rages over nothing, and he would." She faltered, and Frank saw her hand move unconsciously to her ribs. "He would hurt me. I tried to be a good wife, tried to do everything right, but nothing was ever good enough. Then 6 months ago, he gambled away everything we had. Everything. He started talking about coming to the mining towns, making a fresh start. But when we arrived in Telluride 3 weeks ago, he left me at the hotel and did not come back. I waited for 2 days before the hotel owner told me Gerald had been caught cheating at cards. He was shot dead in the street." "I am sorry," Frank said, though he found it hard to muster genuine sympathy for a man who had brutalized his wife. Victoria shook her head. "I am not. God forgive me, but I am not sorry he is dead, but his death left me with nothing. The hotel owner demanded payment, and when I could not pay, he took everything I had, including the clothes on my back except for the dress I was wearing. He threw me out. I have been living in that barn for 5 days, trying to figure out what to do, where to go. I had decided." She trailed off, but Frank understood what she had been about to say. "You do not have to make that decision now," Frank said firmly. "You are safe. You have a room, you have food, and you have time to figure out what comes next. But you will leave, Victoria said, and there was something in her voice that made Frank's heart skip. Mrs. Patterson said you work on a ranch, that you only came to town to sell cattle. You will leave, and then what will I do? Frank stopped walking and turned to face her. The snow was falling more heavily now, catching in her dark hair like stars. She looked up at him with those green eyes that haunted his dreams, and he knew with absolute certainty that he could not leave her. Not now, not ever. Then I will not leave, he said. Victoria's eyes widened. You cannot mean that. You have a job, a life. I can find work here in Telluride, Frank said. The town is growing. They need men to build, to haul, to work the mines. I am strong, I am willing, and I will not leave you alone. Why? Victoria whispered. Why would you give up everything for someone like me? Frank reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. His touch was gentle, reverent, everything her husband's had not been. Because from the moment I saw you in that barn, I knew you were someone worth fighting for. Because you deserve to be happy, to be cherished, to be loved. And because... He hesitated, then plunged forward. Because I am falling in love with you, Victoria Nash. The words hung in the cold air between them, and for a moment, Frank feared he had said too much, too soon. But then Victoria smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face, and he saw what she must have looked like before pain had carved lines around her eyes. You barely know me, she said, but there was wonder in her voice, not disbelief. Then let me know you, Frank said. Let me spend every day learning who you are, what makes you laugh, what makes you happy. Let me be the man who keeps my promise, the man who makes sure you only cry tears of joy from now on. Victoria rose on her toes and kissed him, a soft brush of lips that sent warmth flooding through Frank's entire body despite the cold. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining with tears, but they were good tears, happy tears. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will let you know me. I will let you love me, because I think I am falling in love with you too. They stood in the snow-covered street, holding each other, and Frank felt as though he had found something he had not even known he was searching for. A purpose. A future. A home. The next morning, Christmas Day, Frank woke early and went to the office of the Silver Bell Mining Company. The foreman, a gruff man named Tom Harrison, was known for being fair but hard, and Frank needed to make a good impression. He explained that he was looking for steady work, that he was willing to do whatever was needed. Harrison looked him over, taking in his calloused hands and weathered face, the signs of a man who knew hard labor. You ever worked in a mine? Harrison asked. No, sir, but I am a fast learner and I am not afraid of hard work. Harrison considered this, then nodded. We are always short on timbermen, the fellows who shore up the mine shafts. It is dangerous work, but it pays better than cowboying. If you are interested, you can start after New Year's. I am interested, Frank said without hesitation. He returned to the boarding house to find Victoria helping Mrs. Patterson prepare Christmas dinner. The landlady had invited all her boarders to share the meal, and the common room smelled of roasting chicken and fresh baked bread. Victoria looked up when Frank entered, and the smile that crossed her face made every sacrifice worth it. I have a job, he announced, starting after New Year's, with the Silver Bell Mining Company. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. Mining is dangerous work, Frank. It is, he acknowledged, crossing to her side. But it is steady and it pays well. Well enough that I can rent a small house, make a real home, for us if you will have me. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat loudly. Frank Owens, are you proposing to this girl in my kitchen on Christmas Day? Frank felt his face heat, but he did not look away from Victoria. I suppose I am, though I meant to do it more properly. Victoria's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling. "You do not have to marry me, Frank. You have already done so much." "I do not have to," Frank agreed. "I want to. Victoria, I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few days, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to spend every day proving to you that you are cherished, that you are valued, that you are loved. Will you marry me?" Victoria looked at Mrs. Patterson, who nodded encouragingly, then back at Frank. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I will marry you." The other boarders, who had been pretending not to listen, erupted in applause. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes with her apron and declared that this was the best Christmas gift she could have asked for. The rest of the day passed in a happy blur of food and laughter and plans for the future. Frank and Victoria sat close together, their hands entwined, and he marveled at how completely his life had changed in less than a week. They were married 3 weeks later in the same church where they had attended the Christmas Eve service. Victoria wore a dress that Mrs. Patterson and several other women from town had sewn together, a beautiful creation of cream-colored silk that made her look like an angel. Frank wore his best clothes, his dark hair neatly combed, and when Victoria walked down the aisle toward him, he felt his throat tighten with emotion. The Reverend spoke about love and commitment, about cleaving to one another through good times and bad, and Frank made his vows with his whole heart. When it came time for Victoria to speak, her voice trembled but did not break. "I promise to love you, to honor you, to stand beside you all the days of my life," she said. "You saved me, Frank Owens. In every way a person can be saved. I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that gift." "You already are," Frank whispered. And then they were pronounced husband and wife, and he was kissing her while the small congregation applauded. Frank had managed to rent a small house on the edge of town, a modest 2-room structure with a wood stove and a loft for sleeping. It was not much, but Victoria looked at it as though it were a palace. They spent their wedding night learning each other, Frank moving slowly and carefully, always mindful of the pain her first husband had caused. Victoria wept afterward, but they were tears of joy, of release, of finally understanding what it meant to be truly loved. The months that followed were not easy, but they were happy. Frank worked long, hard days in the mines, coming home exhausted and covered in dust. Victoria kept their little house spotless, cooked hot meals, and slowly began to blossom in the safety of their marriage. She made friends with other women in town, started attending a ladies' sewing circle, and even began to laugh freely, a sound that Frank treasured more than silver or gold. In early spring, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She told Frank over dinner, her hands twisting nervously in her lap, as though she feared his reaction. Instead, Frank let out a whoop of joy that startled her, then swept her into his arms and spun her around until she was laughing and begging him to put her down. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "A baby, Victoria, our baby. Are you happy?" She asked, and he could hear the old fear in her voice, the expectation of disappointment. "Happy?" Frank set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands. "I am more than happy. I am blessed. You have given me everything, Victoria, everything." The pregnancy was not easy. Victoria suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, and Frank would hold her hair back while she was ill, then carry her back to bed and bring her cool water. As her belly grew, she struggled with the mountain heat of summer, and Frank would fan her in the evenings, telling her stories of his childhood in Texas, of the ranch where he had learned to ride, of the sister he had loved and lost. In return, Victoria opened up about her own past. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a merchant who had fallen on hard times. Her mother had died when she was 12, and her father had drunk himself to death by the time she was 18. She had gone to Denver seeking a better life, and instead, she had found Gerald Sutton. But she spoke of those dark times without bitterness now, as though Frank's love had leached the poison from the memories. "I think I had to go through all of that to find you," she said one evening as they sat on the porch of their little house, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "I think God was leading me here to you all along." "Then I am grateful for every step of your journey," Frank said, kissing her forehead. "Even the hard ones, because they brought you to me." Their son was born in October of 1883, on a crisp autumn day when the aspens were turning gold on the mountainsides. The labor was long and difficult, and Frank paced outside their bedroom like a caged animal while Mrs. Patterson and the midwife attended to Victoria. When he finally heard the thin wail of a newborn baby, he burst through the door to find Victoria exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. "A boy," she said, her voice hoarse but happy. "We have a son, Frank." Frank approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the red-faced, squalling infant. He had never seen anything so small, so perfect, so miraculous. "He is beautiful," he whispered. "What should we name him?" "William," Victoria said without hesitation. "After my father before the drinking, when he was still good." "William Owens," Frank said, testing the name. "It is perfect. He is perfect." He took the baby carefully, cradling him against his chest, and William immediately stopped crying. The baby's tiny hand wrapped around Frank's finger, and he felt something shift in his heart, a love so fierce and protective it took his breath away. He looked at Victoria, at this woman who had given him everything, and he knew that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she and their son were safe, happy, and loved. Life settled into a new rhythm after William's birth. Frank continued working in the mines, though he hated being away from his family. Victoria thrived as a mother, and Frank would come home each evening to find her singing to William, rocking him, telling him stories. The baby grew strong and healthy, and by his first birthday, he was walking and getting into everything. The mining work was indeed dangerous, and Frank had several close calls that left Victoria pale and shaken. After a cave-in that trapped him and 3 other men for 6 hours, Victoria begged him to find different work. "I cannot lose you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Frank, please. William needs his father. I need you." Frank held her close, understanding her fear. "I have been saving money," he said. "I have been talking to some of the other men about starting a freight business. Telluride needs goods brought in from Denver and other towns. It would be hard work, but not as dangerous as the mines." "Could we really do that?" Victoria asked hopefully. "We can do anything as long as we are together," Frank said. Over the next year, Frank saved every penny he could spare. He sold his time on weekends hauling goods for local merchants, learning the freight business from the ground up. Victoria took in sewing to contribute to their savings, and slowly, their dream began to take shape. By the summer of 1885, Frank had saved enough to buy 2 sturdy wagons and a team of mules. He quit the mines and started his own freight company, Owens Transport. The business was slow at first, but Frank's reputation for honesty and reliability soon spread. He took on longer routes, sometimes being gone for several days at a time, but the work was steady and far safer than mining. Victoria managed the books, proving to have a sharp mind for numbers, and together they built something solid and lasting. In the spring of 1886, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she was not carrying the weight of past trauma. Their daughter was born in December, 3 years to the day after Frank had found Victoria in that cold barn. They named her Grace, because Victoria said that was what their life together had been, a state of grace. Frank held his daughter and looked at his wife, at his son playing at her feet, at the home they had built together, and he felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. "Do you remember what I promised you?" he asked Victoria. "That night in the barn." Victoria smiled, the same smile that had captivated him from the beginning. "You said I would only cry tears of joy from now on." "Have I kept that promise?" Frank asked. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but they were indeed tears of joy. "Every single day," she whispered. "You have kept it every single day." The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Owens' transport grew, and Frank hired several other drivers to help with the routes. William grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who loved horses and dreamed of being a cowboy like his father had been. Grace was sweet-natured but fierce, with her mother's green eyes and her father's determination. In 1889, Victoria gave birth to twins, 2 more boys they named Samuel and Daniel. The house was always full of noise and laughter, and Frank would sometimes stand in the doorway watching his family, still hardly able to believe this was his life. Victoria would catch him staring and smile, understanding completely. They had both come from such darkness, and together they had built this light. As Telluride grew from a rough mining town into a more established community, Frank and Victoria became pillars of the town. They helped establish a proper school, a library, and a fund to help widows and orphans. Victoria never forgot what it felt like to be desperate and alone, and she made sure that no woman in Telluride would ever have to face what she had faced. On Christmas Eve of 1892, exactly 10 years after the night Frank had found her in the barn, the family attended church together. William was 9 now, tall for his age and protective of his younger siblings. Grace was 6, already showing signs of being a beauty like her mother. The twins were 3 identical mischief makers who kept everyone on their toes. After the service, Frank and Victoria stood outside the church, watching their children play in the snow with other families. Frank wrapped his arm around his wife, pulling her close against the December cold. 10 years, he said softly. "Can you believe it has been 10 years?" Victoria leaned her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime. Other times it feels like just yesterday." "Do you ever think about that night?" Frank asked. "About how things might have been different if I had not gone into that barn?" Victoria shuddered. "I try not to. I know what would have happened. I had given up, Frank. I was ready to let the cold take me. You saved my life in every possible way." "You saved mine too," Frank said. "I was just drifting before I met you, going from job to job, town to town, with no real purpose. You gave me something to live for, something to work for. You gave me a family, a home, a reason to be a better man." "You were always a good man," Victoria said. "That is why I fell in love with you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their children, listening to the sound of Christmas carols drifting from the church. Then Frank turned to face his wife, taking both her hands in his. "I have loved you every day for 10 years, Victoria Owens," he said. "And I will love you every day for the rest of my life. You are my heart, my home, my everything." Victoria smiled through tears, the happy tears that Frank had promised her so long ago. "And you are mine. You kept your promise, Frank, you really did. I have only cried tears of joy since that night." He kissed her then, a kiss that held 10 years of love, gratitude, and commitment. Their children saw them and made exaggerated sounds of disgust the way children do, and Frank and Victoria broke apart laughing. "Papa," William called. "Can we go home for hot chocolate?" "Yes," Frank said. "Let us go home." They walked through the snowy streets of Telluride as a family, the children running ahead, Victoria's hand in Frank's. The town had changed so much in 10 years, had grown and modernized, but their love had remained constant, a foundation that nothing could shake. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. In 1894, William, now 11, broke his arm falling from a horse, and Frank sat with him through the pain, telling him stories about his own cowboy days. Grace started showing talent as an artist, filling the house with drawings and paintings. The twins were inseparable, always getting into trouble together, but also showing signs of the good men they would become. In 1896, Frank's freight business was large enough that he could afford to build Victoria the house she had always dreamed of. A proper 2-story home with a parlor, a big kitchen, and bedrooms for all the children. When he showed her the plans, she wept with joy, remembering the cold barn where he had found her, the tiny 2-room house where they had started their life together. And now this, a real home for their growing family. The house was completed in the spring of 1897, and Victoria spent weeks making it perfect. She sewed curtains for every window, planted flowers in the yard, and arranged their furniture with care. On the day they moved in, Frank carried her over the threshold as he had on their wedding night, and their children cheered and laughed. That night, after the children were all in bed, Frank and Victoria stood on the porch of their new home, looking out at the lights of Telluride sparkling in the valley below. "When I was in that barn," Victoria said quietly, "I could not imagine ever being warm again. I could not imagine being happy, being loved, being safe. And now look at us. Look at what we have built." "We built it together," Frank said. "Every bit of it." Victoria turned to face him, and in the moonlight, she looked almost exactly as she had that first Christmas Eve when he had kissed her in the snow. "Do you know what the best part is?" she asked. "What?" "I wake up every morning and I am still surprised by my happiness. I am still amazed that this is my life, that you are my husband, that those beautiful children sleeping upstairs are ours. I never take it for granted, Frank, not for a single day." "Neither do I," Frank said, pulling her close. "Not for a single day." In 1899, when Victoria discovered she was pregnant again at 39, she worried that she was too old, that something would go wrong. But Frank held her and told her that they would face whatever came together, as they always had. Their 5th child, a daughter they named Faith, was born healthy and strong in February of 1900, right at the turn of the new century. "A new baby for a new century," Victoria said, cradling Faith in her arms. "It feels symbolic somehow." Frank sat beside her on the bed, marveling at how they now had 5 children, how their family had grown and flourished. William was 16 now, already helping with the freight business and showing his father's work ethic. Grace was 13, beautiful and talented, with suitors already starting to pay attention despite her youth. The twins were 11, still inseparable but starting to develop their own interests. And now Faith, tiny and perfect, completing their family. "We are blessed," Frank said simply. "More blessed than I ever dared to dream." The new century brought changes to Telluride and to the West. Electricity came to town, along with telephones and automobiles, though Frank still preferred his horses and wagons. William took over more of the freight business as he got older, allowing Frank to spend more time at home with Victoria and the younger children. Grace met a young man, the son of a banker, who treated her with respect and genuine affection. And Frank gave his blessing to their courtship while Victoria fretted that her daughter was still too young. The twins, Samuel and Daniel, were accepted to a university in Denver, a source of great pride for both Frank and Victoria. Neither of them had much formal education, but they had worked hard to ensure their children would have opportunities they had never had. When the twins left for school in 1905, Victoria cried, but they were tears of joy mixed with sadness, the bittersweet emotion of watching children grow up and move into the world. Little Faith grew into a bright, curious child who loved books and asked endless questions about everything. She was particularly close to her father, and Frank would spend hours reading to her, answering her questions, taking her on walks through the mountains around Telluride. In 1908, when Frank was 52 and Victoria was 48, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. William and his new wife hosted a party at the big house, inviting everyone they had known over the years. The house was full of laughter and music, of old friends and new, of their children and their children's friends. At one point in the evening, Frank pulled Victoria outside onto the porch away from the crowd. The night was cold, reminding him of that long-ago December when their lives had begun. 25 years, he said. A quarter of a century. Victoria leaned against him, comfortable and content. The best 25 years of my life. Mine too, Frank said. Do you remember when I promised you would only cry tears of joy? You ask me that every year, Victoria said with a smile. And every year my answer is the same. You have kept that promise, Frank. You have kept it every day. There were hard times, Frank said. The years when money was tight, when the children were sick, when we lost people we loved. There were, Victoria agreed. They had buried Mrs. Patterson 5 years before, and her loss had been keenly felt. But we faced those times together, and that made all the difference. We held each other up. We never stopped loving each other. Never, Frank agreed, and I never will. They stood together in the cold, listening to the sounds of celebration from inside, and Frank thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a freezing barn to this moment, from despair to joy, from loneliness to love. It had not always been easy, but it had always been worth it. In 1910, Grace married her banker's son in a beautiful ceremony that had Victoria crying happy tears from start to finish. The twins graduated from university and returned to Telluride, Samuel to practice law and Daniel to become a teacher. William's wife gave birth to Frank and Victoria's first grandchild, a boy they named Frank Jr., and when Frank held his grandson for the first time, he felt the circle of life complete itself in a way that was both humbling and profound. Victoria, now a grandmother at 50, was still as beautiful to Frank as she had been at 22. Her dark hair was streaked with silver now, and there were lines around her eyes, but they were laugh lines, happiness lines, the marks of a life well lived. She moved more slowly than she once had, but she still ran their household with efficiency and grace, still took care of everyone around her, still lit up when Frank walked into a room. Faith, at 10 years old, was fascinated by her new nephew and declared she wanted to have 6 children when she grew up. Victoria laughed and told her that babies were wonderful but exhausting, and perhaps she should wait and see how she felt when she was older. The years rolled on, bringing more grandchildren, more changes, more joys. Frank eventually retired from the freight business entirely, turning it over to William, who ran it with the same integrity his father had shown. Frank and Victoria spent their time traveling occasionally, visiting their children and grandchildren, but mostly they were content to stay in Telluride, in the town where their love story had begun. In 1915, on the anniversary of the night Frank had found Victoria in the barn, they made a pilgrimage to Henderson's old property. The barn was still standing, though barely, weathered by 33 years of harsh Colorado winters. They stood outside it, holding hands, remembering. "I was so lost," Victoria said quietly. "So broken. I thought my life was over." "And now?" Frank asked. Victoria turned to him, and her eyes were bright with tears, but they were the tears he had promised her so long ago, tears of joy and gratitude and deep, abiding love. Now I know my life was just beginning. Everything I have, everything I am, everything I have become, it all started here with a cowboy who showed me kindness when I had given up hope. You gave me everything, Frank said. A purpose, a family, a reason to be better than I was. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Victoria Owens. They kissed in front of the old barn, two people in their 50s who had loved each other for more than 30 years and would love each other for however many years they had left. When they finally pulled apart, Victoria rested her head on Frank's shoulder, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the San Juan Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. By 1920, Frank and Victoria had 11 grandchildren, with more on the way. William's business had expanded to cover the entire region. Grace's husband had become president of the bank, and she was known throughout Telluride for her artwork and her charity work. The twins were both married with children of their own, and Faith, now 20, was engaged to a young engineer who worked on the railroad. Frank was 64 now, his hair completely gray, his body showing the wear of decades of hard work. But he was still strong, still active, and still completely devoted to his wife. Victoria was 60, and though she sometimes joked about feeling old, Frank thought she was more beautiful than ever. She had lived a life of love and service, and it showed in the peaceful contentment that radiated from her. On Christmas Eve of 1920, exactly 38 years after the night they had met, the entire family gathered at the big house for dinner. The table was crowded with children and grandchildren, with laughter and stories and love. Frank looked around at all these people, this family that had grown from two broken souls who had found each other in the darkness, and he felt his throat tighten with emotion. After dinner, Victoria suggested they all go to church for the Christmas Eve service, continuing the tradition that had started so many years before. The entire clan bundled up and walked through the snowy streets of Telluride, filling 2 entire pews at the church. The Reverend, a young man who had grown up hearing the story of Frank and Victoria's romance, smiled when he saw them all together. After the service, as the family began to disperse to their various homes, Frank and Victoria stood outside the church, watching their children and grandchildren disappear into the snowy night. Faith was the last to leave, kissing both her parents and promising to see them for Christmas dinner the next day. When they were alone, Frank turned to Victoria. "Walk with me, in this cold," Victoria said with a laugh. "We are not as young as we used to be, Frank Owens." "I know," Frank said. "But I have something I want to show you." Curious, Victoria took his arm and they walked through the familiar streets of Telluride, past the houses they had lived in over the years, past the site of Frank's old freight office, past Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, which was now a hotel. Finally, they stopped in front of a small building that Victoria recognized as the new library. "Why are we here?" she asked. Frank pulled a key from his pocket and opened the door. Inside, the library was dark and quiet, but he lit a lamp, and Victoria saw that they were standing in front of a wall of photographs. Images of Telluride through the years, documenting the town's growth and change. And there, in the center of the display, was a photograph of Frank and Victoria on their wedding day, young and hopeful and so much in love. Below the photo was a small plaque that read, "Frank and Victoria Owens, married January 14, 1883. Their love story is a testament to the enduring power of kindness, courage, and commitment." Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, and tears streamed down her face. "Frank, when did you do this?" The library committee asked for photographs that showed the history of Telluride, Frank said. I gave them this one because I think our story is worth remembering. Not because we are special, but because we are proof that love can heal, that people can change, that no matter how dark things seem, there is always hope. Victoria turned to him, this man who had saved her life and then spent nearly 4 decades making sure she knew she was loved. I love you, she said. I have loved you every day since you found me in that barn, and I will love you every day until I draw my last breath. And I love you, Frank said, pulling her close. You are my heart, my home, my everything. You always have been, and you always will be. They stood together in the quiet library, surrounded by the history of their town and their life, and Victoria thought about that terrified, broken girl who had huddled in a freezing barn, certain her life was over. She thought about the kind cowboy who had promised her joy, and how he had kept that promise every single day. You know, Victoria said softly, you told me I would only cry tears of joy from that night on, and you were right. Every tear I have cried since then has been a happy one. Tears when our children were born, tears when they got married, tears when I held my grandchildren. Even the sad tears when we lost people we loved, they were bittersweet because they came from a place of deep love and gratitude for having known those people. You gave me a life worth crying happy tears over, Frank. You gave me everything. Frank kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. We gave each other everything. That is what love is, Victoria. It is not one person saving another. It is 2 people choosing each other every day through everything. It is building a life together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, until suddenly you look back and realize you have created something beautiful and lasting. They locked up the library and walked home through the snowy streets, moving more slowly than they once had, but still together, still strong in their love. When they reached their house, they stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the warm light glowing in the windows, knowing that tomorrow their family would fill these rooms with laughter and love. Merry Christmas, Victoria, Frank said. Merry Christmas, Frank, Victoria replied. They went inside together, into the warmth, into the life they had built, into the love that had sustained them for 38 years and would sustain them for however many years remained. And as Victoria got ready for bed, catching sight of her reflection in the mirror, she smiled, remembering that cold, desperate girl in the barn and marveling at the woman she had become, at the life she had lived, at the love she had found. That night, as they lay in bed together, Frank's arms around her, Victoria thought about all the ways her life could have ended in that barn. She thought about the darkness she had been drowning in, the pain she had been carrying, the hopelessness that had nearly consumed her. And then she thought about the door opening, about a kind voice in the darkness, about a promise that had seemed impossible but had come true in ways she never could have imagined. Thank you, she whispered. For what? Frank asked sleepily. For keeping your promise, for loving me, for giving me a life worth living. Frank tightened his arms around her. Thank you for letting me, for trusting me, for building this beautiful life with me. They fell asleep together, as they had for 38 years, and outside the snow continued to fall on Telluride, Colorado, covering the world in a blanket of white, pure and clean and full of promise, just like the love that had bloomed in a cold barn on a December night so long ago. The years continued to pass gently for Frank and Victoria. In 1925, they celebrated their 42nd wedding anniversary surrounded by 14 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. Frank was 69 now, and Victoria was 65, and though their bodies had slowed, their love had only deepened with time. They spent their days in peaceful routine, taking walks when the weather allowed, sitting on their porch watching the world go by, entertaining the constant stream of children and grandchildren who came to visit. Victoria still sewed, though her fingers were not as nimble as they once had been, and Frank still told stories, delighting the youngest generation with tales of the Old West, of cowboys and cattle drives and the wild frontier that was slowly disappearing. On quiet evenings, they would sit by the fire, Victoria reading aloud while Frank listened, or sometimes just sitting in companionable silence, holding hands, needing no words to communicate the love that flowed between them. Faith, their youngest, gave birth to her fourth child in the spring of 1926, and when Victoria held her newest grandchild, she marveled at the continuing circle of life, at how love multiplied and spread, touching more people with each generation. "When I found you in that barn," Frank said one evening, watching Victoria rock their newest grandchild, "I could not have imagined all of this. All these people who exist because we found each other." "It is amazing, is not it?" Victoria said softly. "One act of kindness, one moment of compassion, and look what grew from it. 44 years later, and our love has created all of this." In the fall of 1927, Frank's health began to decline. He had lived a hard life, and his body was finally showing the strain. Victoria nursed him with the same devotion he had shown her so many years ago, sitting by his bedside, holding his hand, telling him stories of their life together. "You have any regrets?" Frank asked her one evening, his voice weak but his eyes still bright with love. "Not a single one," Victoria said firmly. "You gave me a beautiful life, Frank Owens. You kept every promise you ever made to me. I have been blessed beyond measure." "You made me a better man," Frank said. "You gave me purpose, love, family. You were the best thing that ever happened to me." "And you were mine," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. But even these tears, sad as they were, had joy in them, gratitude for 44 years of love, for a life well lived together. Frank lingered through the winter, determined to see one more Christmas with Victoria, one more anniversary in January. On Christmas Eve of 1927, exactly 45 years after the night they had met, the whole family gathered around his bedside. He was too weak to go to church, but the Reverend came to them, offering prayers and comfort. When everyone had left for the night, Victoria climbed carefully into bed beside Frank, as she had done for 44 years. She laid her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her with what little strength he had left. "You remember," Frank whispered, "what I promised you that night in the barn? You said I would only cry tears of joy from that night on," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "Did I keep my promise?" Frank asked. Victoria raised herself up so she could look into his eyes, those kind eyes that had seen her at her worst and had chosen to love her anyway. "Every single day," she said. "You kept it every single day, Frank. Even now, even in this sadness, there is joy. Joy that I knew you, that I loved you, that we had this beautiful life together. You kept your promise, my love. You kept every promise." Frank smiled, and it was the same smile he had given her in that snowy street 45 years ago, full of love and hope and promise. "I love you, Victoria Owens. I love you with everything I am, everything I have been, everything I will be." "And I love you," Victoria whispered, "now and forever." Frank drew his last breath just after midnight, as Christmas Day began, with Victoria holding him close and whispering words of love into his ear. When he was gone, Victoria lay beside him for a long time, feeling the absence of his warmth, his presence, the love that had sustained her for so many years. But even in her grief, she felt gratitude. Gratitude for that cold December night when a cowboy had walked into a barn and had chosen kindness. Gratitude for 44 years of love, for children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, for a life she had never dared to dream of when she had been huddled in the cold, waiting to die. The funeral was held 3 days later, and it seemed like half of Telluride turned out to pay their respects to Frank Owens, a man who had lived with integrity, kindness, and love. Victoria stood straight and strong, supported by her children, and she told stories about Frank that had people laughing through their tears. After the service, as everyone gathered at the big house, William pulled his mother aside. "Are you going to be all right, Mama?" Victoria looked at her oldest son, this man who looked so much like his father, and she smiled. "I am going to be fine. Your father gave me everything, William. He gave me all of you. He gave me 44 years of love. He gave me a life I treasure. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I will never regret a single moment, and that is a gift, a precious gift." Victoria lived for 8 more years after Frank's death. She remained in the big house, surrounded by family, welcomed into the homes of her children and grandchildren. She told stories about Frank to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive, making sure the younger generations knew about the kind cowboy who had saved a broken woman and had loved her faithfully for over 4 decades. She attended church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew where she and Frank had sat for so many years. She continued her charity work, helping women in need, remembering what it felt like to have nothing and making sure others did not have to face that darkness alone. On Christmas Eve of 1935, Victoria's children insisted she stay home rather than venture out into the cold for the church service. At 75, she was frail and they worried about her. But Victoria was adamant. "I have attended Christmas Eve service every year since your father found me in that barn," she said firmly. 53 years. I am not going to miss it now." So they bundled her up in warm clothes and helped her to church, where 3 generations of her family surrounded her with love. During the service, Victoria closed her eyes and could almost feel Frank beside her, could almost hear his voice joining hers in the familiar carols. That night back at home, Victoria asked Faith to help her to the small room she had turned into a memory room, filled with photographs and mementos of her life with Frank. She stood in front of their wedding photograph, the same one that hung in the library, and she smiled. "I kept my promise too," she whispered as though Frank could hear her. "I let you love me. I built this beautiful life with you, and I have lived every day since you left me with gratitude for the time we had. I am ready now, my love. I am ready to see you again." She went to bed that night and passed peacefully in her sleep. 53 years to the day after Frank had found her crying in a cold barn and had promised her she would only cry tears of joy from that night on. At Victoria's funeral, her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren celebrated a life well lived, a love story for the ages. William stood and told the story of how his parents had met, how his father had saved his mother, and how their love had created this entire family. "My father made a promise that night in the barn," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "He promised that my mother would only cry tears of joy from that night on, and he kept that promise. Every day of their 44 years together, he loved her, cherished her, made her feel valued and safe. And after he died, my mother continued to live in the light of that love. She told us often that even in her grief, she felt joy because she had been blessed to know my father, to love him and be loved by him. Their love created all of us. Their love taught us what it means to be kind, to be faithful, to keep your promises. And that legacy will live on in all of us and in the generations to come." Frank and Victoria were buried side by side in the Telluride Cemetery under a headstone that read, "Frank and Victoria Owens, united in love on earth, reunited in love in heaven. He kept his promise. And in the years that followed, as their children grew old and their grandchildren had children of their own, the story of the cowboy who found a woman crying in a cold barn and promised her joy was passed down through the generations. It became a treasured family legend, a reminder that love can heal, that kindness can transform, that one moment of compassion can change not just one life, but countless lives. In Telluride, Colorado, the big house where Frank and Victoria had raised their family was eventually donated to the town and turned into a museum celebrating the history of the area. The barn where they had met was long gone, but a plaque was placed on the spot, commemorating the night when two lost souls had found each other and had begun a love story that would last not just a lifetime, but for generations. And every Christmas Eve, descendants of Frank and Victoria Owens gathered in Telluride for church service, continuing the tradition that had begun so many years ago. They sang the same carols, sat in the same pews, and remembered the cowboy and the woman he had saved, whose love had created a legacy that would never be forgotten. Their story became more than just a family legend. It was taught in local schools as an example of the resilience and compassion that had built the West. Young couples would visit their grave, holding hands, making their own promises to love faithfully, to be kind, to create their own legacy of love. The photograph from the library was reprinted in history books about Telluride, a symbol of enduring love in the face of hardship. As decades turned into a century, the world changed in ways Frank and Victoria could never have imagined. Telluride transformed from a rough mining town into a ski resort destination, attracting visitors from around the world. But through all the changes, the story of Frank and Victoria Owens remained constant, a reminder of a simpler time when a promise was sacred and love was worth fighting for. Great-great-grandchildren, who never knew Frank and Victoria, personally still felt the impact of their love. The values they had instilled, the example they had set, the legacy they had created, all of it rippled forward through time, touching lives, shaping futures, proving that one act of kindness in a cold barn on a December night could echo through the ages. And so the story ends where it began, in a barn on a cold December night, with a woman crying and a cowboy who chose kindness. But it also ends with a family that spans generations, with a love that transcended death, with a promise kept not just in one lifetime but in all the lifetimes that followed. Frank Owens had promised Victoria Nash that she would only cry tears of joy from that night on, and in keeping that promise, he had created something eternal, something beautiful, something that proved beyond any doubt that love, true love, never dies. It only grows, multiplies, and spreads, touching everyone it reaches, creating light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, and hope where there was once only despair.